I guess my question is, why did it take us so long to get here? So what was your experience in the movement trying to talk about these issues to people like me who are like, oh yeah, that's, yeah, anti-racism, right on, but not
Right.
really
Well,
taking.
you know that the biggest example that was my experience was because, right, you know, after I did that work with INCAR, I got very, very involved working with domestic workers and with women who were coming to Canada from the Caribbean and from the first from the Caribbean and then more from the Philippines to work as like live-in caregivers in uh, private homes in Vancouver. Right, and I was working. It was funny how I ended up there, but anyway, I was working for a community organization and I got introduced to some women who were domestic workers from like St. Lucia, St. Vincent, Jamaica. And I just started finding out what was going on in their lives and what this was like. So they, you know, they were in Canada on temporary work permits. Their staying in Canada was completely dependent on their employer. They were unbelievably exploited in many, many, many cases, right? And sometimes jobs, you know, there was very unscrupulous agencies bringing women into the country. Sometimes jobs materialized, sometimes they didn't. Then they were so underpaid, overworked, often sexually abused, you know, so many things going on there. And I again was like, oh my God, this is so unjust, right? This is horrible, right? And I started just accompanying some of them to immigration, right? To change permits, to change employers, I started sort of being an advocate. I was 19 at the time. And I didn't even think about like, what am I doing here? What's my role here? Should I be doing this? Should I not be doing? I was just like, oh my God, this is so awful. Like something has to be done. And so it turned into like a 10-year commitment. Like I ended up working with and on behalf of domestic workers, and some of us started an organization, and we created legal materials, and we lobbied for employment standards, and we became part of a national campaign about good enough to work, good enough to stay, to try and get landed status for people. But for me, that whole experience was about learning about racism, right? And class, right? Class and race, and how it actually operates and how it actually looks in people's lives. And I would sit there in the immigration office, you know, where they have only those dividers, right? Like, so you can hear what's going on around you, and you can hear other immigration officers talking to other people. And I was there with somebody, you know, dealing with an immigration officer. And I just saw the abuse and the disrespect and the dehumanization and all of that. So for me, that was like a huge education, really. I learned so much from doing that. But then at the same time, in the women's movement, there was a conversation beginning about race and class. And people were reading about race and reading about class, and there were confrontations happening, and a lot of those difficult conversations. And then we would have a demonstration. We would call an event or call a demonstration in support of domestic workers, and nobody would come. Like nobody would come from the women's movement or from the lesbian movement, except for a handful of people. There were a handful of people who would come. And it's funny because I was reading just a couple of days ago, I was reading a PhD dissertation that somebody did about that period of time, the women's movement, and that there really was an analysis of domestic labor, right, and women's unpaid labor and the value of women's unpaid labor. But there wasn't an analysis of paid domestic labor. And so this whole experience of paid migrant domestic workers was kind of unseen and not tied in. And so it was always shocking to me. It was like, why are people not showing up? Like, this is a feminist issue, right? This is exactly what we're talking about. Why are people not here? And I guess it was somehow the nature of the movement at that time and who was in it and who, you know, whose interests were being represented. Similarly in gay and lesbian and later queer and trans movements, in terms of being mostly composed of kind of white middle class people. And so then the issues became centered around the interests of those people, myself included, right? So that was always shocking to me, like that experience. Yeah. And has it changed? I mean, the experience of migrant domestic workers, I'm not sure it's changed so much. We did make some gains, we did win the right to get landed after 2 years if you met this criteria and that criteria and this criteria. And that's all, I believe, being rolled back now. Like they're,
Really?
yeah, yeah. So this is 35 years later, right? Um, like, and that's part of this work, right? Is like, it's so hard, that's why I understand, like, the rage of Black people right now, right, is like, how many years, how many years, how many bodies, how many deaths, how many murders do we have to see before people pay attention, right? And I know what's happening for me in this moment also is because I've spent so many years doing solidarity work with Palestinians, and I'm hoping that this moment where people are becoming aware of issues of racism will also be a moment where people pay attention to what's happening in Palestine and to Palestinians, because that the Jewish narrative around Israel is so strong that I feel like even when we see the images of what happens to Palestinians in Gaza, when we see Israeli police violence against Palestinians, just last week, they killed a 32-year-old unarmed autistic Palestinian man. Like, where's the outrage? And yeah. So I hope that in this moment of awareness, of heightened awareness, I feel like we're in this moment of, like, you cannot ignore what's happening right now. I think